All right, guys, we are back. Part 2 in the program design series, the program design Chronicles, a squat dad story. What did we talk about in part 1? Make sure you go back and watch that part first. We talked about step 1, which was our needs analysis, and step 2, which came down to exercise selection. So go rewatch that if you haven't already before we get into this. But let's dive in. So step 3, when you sit down to write out your training program, is the follow. It's identifying training frequency. And when we talk about frequency, we have to define it. Is it daily? Is it weekly? Is it monthly? Most commonly, you hear people talk about weekly frequency. I train 3 times a week, I train 4 times a week, whatever it may be. And we'll talk about some special situations where we talk about daily frequency, maybe for a weightlifter or a team sport athlete. But for the scope of hypertrophy training, for the most part, we're really just talking about once a day training. Rarely, if ever, will you hear people talk about monthly training, maybe in team sports, but it's not very common. Now, what are your main determinants of frequency? Number 1 is going to be availability. How available are you to train? How many days can you actually give me? Is it 2 days a week, 4 days a week, 6 days a week? Because I'm going to take whatever you give me and write your plan accordingly. Number 2 is going to be the athlete training status and the age. You can see over on the right here in the table from the CSCS textbook, we have some general recommendations based off the advancement of the athlete in their training career. Are they a beginner? Are they intermediate? Are they advanced? And then the recommended training sessions based off that. A lot of that comes down to recovery. As you get further on into your training career, you can recover a little bit faster. But we'll talk about why that's not always the case, and these recommendations shouldn't be written in stone. Can a beginner train 6-7 times a week? Yes, they can. They just have to make some modifications to the training that they're actually doing. Third determinant of frequency is going to be what the athlete is, the type of athlete. Are they a team sport athlete? This is a football player that has maybe practice in the morning, 9 a.m. they have sport practice, and they come back at 4 p.m. for resistance training for their weight session. So that'll be a twice a day frequency. How many days a week are they doing that? For powerlifting, for the most part, it's going to be once a day training. There are some powerlifters who get into twice a day training. But when we talk about powerlifting and we discuss frequency, it's more going to be about the squat, bench, and the deadlift frequency, the competition lift frequency, than it is about overall training frequency. Weightlifting really runs the gambit in terms of frequency. You have some people that train once a day, and then you have people in the Bulgarian system that are maxing out a front squat or a back squat or a power clean or a snatch, something like that, 8 times a day. So they really run some high frequencies for very specific reasons. For bodybuilding, there's really 2 camps. You've got the train once a day camp and the train twice a day camp. The train once a day camp is the one that it's really all the time that they have, but there are some benefits to doing your bodybuilding training twice a day. So let's say you've got a leg training session where you normally do quadriceps and then you do hamstrings. By putting those 2 together, whatever you do first, the second half of that session is going to suffer. So if I separate the 2, I do quads in the morning, full day of resting and eating, and then in the late afternoon I do hamstrings, maybe the quality of this hamstring work over here, now that it's separated from the quads, is that much better, and it gives you it gives you more benefit from your training. Maybe, not 100% sold on that. Another thing would be what other training is the individual doing. So is this maybe a CrossFit athlete who just wants to do some hypertrophy training? So they've got to do their aerobic conditioning, their anaerobic conditioning as well. That's going to take away. Maybe those are multiple sessions per day. How are you going to organize that? Could be that they're partaking in another sport. Maybe they like Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, mixed martial arts, cycling, swimming, really anything there. What other outside training are we dealing with? And then the last variable here is going to be life stressors. So things like a stressful job, manual labor versus a desk job. Do you like your job or not? That's one that people don't often talk about, the stress of going to a job that you dislike. Obligations with kids, maybe obligations with the military. And with the military, there's a lot of considerations here. What branch are they in? Are they deployed? Are they in the reserves? Because there's going to be different PT requirements for different levels of the military and different deployment statuses that you have to factor in when trying to get the most out of someone's training. And then last would be relationships. Other obligations, happy, unhappy, just things that add to that total stress pool. Remember that the body doesn't know different types of stress. It doesn't know training stress from my girlfriend broke up with me. That's just lumped in as stress. So you have to factor all that stuff in. Maybe you have to dial down the frequency to allow a little bit more recovery if some of those stressful situations are there. And that brings me to the last point here, which is recovery, recovery, recovery. If you can recover in time to train again, then you are ready to increase your frequency. But if you increase your frequency so much that it's taking away from your recovery, you're no longer able to recover in between sessions, that's a poor use of an increase in frequency because it's actually taking away from your training, not benefiting. Remember, when we implement these variables, we want them to benefit our training or have us get more out of training, not actually take away from our training. So availability to train. For hypertrophic outcomes, and we saw in my last presentation, the Q&A video on training frequency, the majority or the consensus of the literature is that 2 times a week frequency will beat 1 time a week frequency for your advanced athletes or for your more seasoned lifters. Now, is there a benefit to 3 times a week, 4 times a week, 5 times a week? The research hasn't fleshed that out. Some people say yes. Some people say the difference would be so small, it would be undetectable. But we'll wait and we'll see what the research says on that when we have more of it. But here I gave you some different ways that you can split up your training based off of the availability to train, making sure that we hit every body part or every muscle group at least twice a week. So if you've only got 2 days a week of training, you're in the 2 time a week group, you have to do full body 2 times a week. 3 times a week, you can do full body 3 times. Maybe you do an upper lower full 4 times a week. Maybe you're going to do full body 4 times a week, upper lower, cycle that 2 times through, push pull legs, and then full body. Some more options there. You can see as we move down to the 5 times a week and the 6 time a week group, we're just presented with significantly more options. The more availability the person has, the more you can either spread out or condense their volume, limit the volume per session. You as the coach have a lot more avenues that you can go down with the client. Now, considerations about what is best, what's optimal for the actual client. Number one is going to be personal preference. What do they enjoy doing? There's been dogma, or there's been this dogmatic attitude in the bodybuilding world for a very long time that to get the most out of a training session, you really kind of have to beat the shit out of a muscle group to make it grow. And more recent literature has shown that that is not the case. But some people are stuck in that mindset where maybe they're going to get more out of doing full body 3 times a week, but they still want to have a push-pull legs where they can really hammer their pushing muscles, really hammer the pulling muscles, and really crush the legs because they feel like that's going to be more effective. And remember, a training program that the client follows is always going to be superior to maybe a more optimized training program that they don't follow. So make sure it caters to the personal preference of the client first, while still fitting into the realms of being evidence-based. The second point here is going to be volume tolerance. You have some people who are extremely volume tolerant, usually smaller individuals, females as well, that can handle 12, 14, 15 sets per body part per session, whereas your larger male individuals may only be able to handle 6, 8 sessions or 6 to 8 sets per body part in a session before their quality of their work starts to really drop off. So how well do they handle volume? Can I condense it into one day, or do I need to spread it out more? Final argument here, and I've heard this thrown around a lot recently, would be muscle protein synthesis signaling. As you get more advanced as a lifter, the window of elevated muscle protein synthesis after a resistance training bout actually gets shorter. So you resistance trained, let's say you did a bicep workout when you were a beginner, muscle protein synthesis in the biceps will be elevated for 48, 72 hours. As you get more advanced, that window gets shorter and shorter, starts to move towards that 24-hour mark, and then you can see, well, maybe if I train biceps 4 or 5 times a week, I can elevate muscle protein synthesis more often and stimulate more growth. Again, let's wait for the research before we make any conclusions there. So training status and age, a very important thing to consider. This is whether someone's a beginner, intermediate, or advanced. For the most part, and there is some nuance here, but I will say this, for the most part, more training experience as you move from beginner to intermediate or intermediate to advanced, you're going to recover faster. Remember the first day you went into the gym, you did like 3 sets of leg press and 3 sets of leg extension, your quads were so messed up for the next couple days that you could barely even walk. But then you go into the gym today and you do that exact same workout and you're not sore at all. Why? Because you're more advanced and you can recover significantly faster. But there is some nuance here that we need to consider. Introducing novel exercises. So let's say you've been back squatting for 8 months straight. You switch over to front squat, you're going to notice that you're extremely sore. Your recovery is going to be hindered. So when you throw in new exercises, be careful with how frequently you put them in. Yeah, you used to back squat 4 times a week, but that doesn't necessarily mean that you can put in strenuous front squatting workouts like my boy Lu Xiaojun over here 4 times a week as well. Maybe you'll have to start at 2 times a week and build your way up so that you can actually recover between sessions. The last point here that I want to make is that as you get more advanced, you also get stronger. As you get stronger, different parts of the body get stressed to a higher degree than just the muscles. We can't think of recovery as just being a muscular thing. It's also a nervous system thing. It's also a connective tissue thing. It's also a psychological thing where you can only get ramped up to ram your head against a heavy squat so many times in a week. The example that I give on this one where strength becomes an issue is someone like Eric Lillibridge. I haven't really kept up with Eric, but he used to squat well over 1,000 pounds. And he would squat once a week or once every 10 days. And this was the time when the evidence-based crowd was saying squat 3, 4, 5 times a week. If Eric Lillibridge had squatted 5 times in a week, challenging squat workouts, he would have absolutely snapped in half. It's just not possible for him. So when you're sitting down with a client, the first thing you want to do is identify, is this individual an intermediate, a beginner, an intermediate, or advanced? And that's not just training age, how long they've been training, but how long have they been correctly training or progressively training. And then from there, you want to move some stuff around. So give them more rest days, less total volume. Maybe you spread the volume out a little bit more. As a coach, you've really got quite a few options here to utilize. So just use your best judgment. Trial and error will be your friend. Now, the type of athlete. Different sports, different strokes, different folks. So team sports. Most team sports, especially in their off-season period where they're far removed from competition, they will be training twice a day where they've got their sport practice. It's usually a low-volume sport practice and a high-intensity or a high-volume resistance training session. So with that, you want to make sure that you're arranging frequency accordingly. If they've got a really, really hard sport practice that day, it doesn't really make much sense to have a very hard resistance training session that day. So maybe you move that resistance training, that hard resistance training, away from the hard sport practice session and substitute an easier one in there. Maybe you just dial back the frequency, dial up the frequency accordingly. In powerlifting, frequency is more often described as being frequency of the competition lift. So how often are you squatting, benching, and deadlifting? And this has a lot of considerations. So one being the fatigue from the lifts. So exercises where you're significantly stronger can move a greater absolute load. Those are going to be more fatiguing overall. So the squat and the deadlift will always be more fatiguing than the bench press, granted that you're working at a high percentage of your 1 rep max. You're moving a higher absolute load. Frequency is also going to be dictated by weaknesses. So what lifts are you actually good at? Because if you're absolute dog shit at the bench press, then you need to do a higher frequency of the bench press just to groove that movement more, kind of facilitate faster motor learning, which will then translate over into greater strength. With weightlifting, we're looking at 1 to 2 times a day, depending on the phase of training. Now, there are some extremes. We talked about the Bulgarians who were training, maxing out up to 8 times a day. We'll throw them out. Lots of drugs. Don't worry about them. They're a poor example to use. Weightlifters, 1 to 2 times a day, usually once a day training. Now, for bodybuilding, which is hypertrophy training, the focus of this presentation as a whole, we're looking at 1 to 2 times a day. This is depending on volume tolerance and schedule. If you've got the time to split your session up into 2 different distinct sessions removed from each other with some food and some rest in between, you should absolutely do so, because theoretically and in practice, what most people see is that second session becomes a lot higher quality when you remove it from the other. So if you're someone who has a very, very high or a great volume tolerance, like you can do 10, 12, 15 sessions per body part, it makes sense to split it up. So if your MRV, your maximum recoverable volume, or you can handle quite a bit of volume, you want to split that up to make sure all of that volume is quality. One thing I do want to say on the type of athlete is go watch the Brute Showdown right here. A great series. If you just Brute Showdown, women's edition, it's a good series to watch, looking at different types of athletes. All right, up next, and the last point on training frequency here is that you want to look at other training and life stressors. So most people who are in the pursuit of winning the hypertrophy, they're trying to become big, jacked, and tan. They also do other things for fun. We're not all beep boop robots that just do bicep curls and Smith machine squats all day. We do some other stuff for fun. So me, I'm a tennis aficionado. I like to play some tennis on the weekends. Some people like to do MMA, Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, softball, basketball, swimming, surfing, kickball, all that fun stuff. Now that stuff is fun. We do it for fun. We do it for enjoyment. But at the same time, it is still stressful. It's still training. It's still exertion. And we need to consider that. So if you've got an athlete or a client that comes to you and they say, hey, I want to do a bodybuilding show, but I will not give up the 5 days a week that I spend surfing. I don't know how you have time for 5 days a week of surfing, but they won't give that up. Then you need to arrange their training in a fashion that accommodates that outside life stressor. Some other considerations, aerobic conditioning. So is this someone who is a certified psychopath that likes to run 5Ks and they want to incorporate some sort of aerobic conditioning as well? How are you going to factor into that into the program in terms of dialing down the resistance training frequency to tolerate that outside stressor? And then the other ones, work, relationships, kids, other obligations, military, coaching. Good example of coaching would be Ray Williams, who just squatted significantly lower than he ever has, and everyone's like, what happened? Why is he doing that? Well, he's currently in the middle of football season, and he's a high school football coach, so he's out on his feet in the heat a lot of time throughout the day, so that actually reduced his ability to perform. So it just shows you how stress can even affect someone who's an elite athlete like that. Then you get into some other random stuff, moving, changing jobs, all that. Stuff that just is stress, adds up, throw it into that same bucket, still got to recover from it. All right, step 4. We move through step 3. Step 4 is a quick one. It's exercise order. You've all seen stuff like this before. This infographic over here that shows how should you organize your training for strength or muscle. Overall, it's decent, but it lacks the nuance. Your traditional strength conditioning wisdom is, and this is strength conditioning for athletic performance, is that we start with power exercises, so your Olympic lifts or variants of that, jumps, throws, things like that. Then your core lifts, so not core like the abs or the lower back, but core like the main lift in the program. So for like a basketball player that wants to improve their vertical jump, their core lift would be something like a back squat or a front squat. And then any other core lifts followed by assistance and isolation. Now that's fine and dandy, and it makes perfect sense in the athletic population because athletes are power driven and then strength after that, and they don't care too much, or they're not too hindered by being fatigued going into their assistance work. But with bodybuilders, there's a couple other considerations that we have to make here, or for hypertrophy training. And we have to start by saying, well, what is hypertrophy actually driven by? Well, it's downstream. Hypertrophic signals are mediated by tension. So they're mediated by mechanical tension felt by the muscle. How do I achieve high mechanical tension? Well, I can lift a heavy load, or I can lift something in close proximity to failure. That's a good way to stimulate the high threshold motor units and stimulate those type 2 muscle fibers. So I can do that, and I can do that using a variety of exercises. And we just look at Brad Schoenfeld's research that compared the very low load training to the very high load training, similar hypertrophy as long as they were training at the same proximity to failure. So we can achieve that in very different ways. What about pre-exhausting the muscle? What if I go and do a couple sets of leg extensions to fatigue my quads, and then I go over and I do squats? Will I suffer? Will I benefit? Well, the tension is still there. The fatigue allows me to tap into those high threshold motor units earlier on and with lower load. So can pre-exhausting be a good technique to use? I would say it can. Yeah, it's definitely something that you should have in your tool belt. And more recently, we've seen it become very, very popular that people are starting to use the effective reps and the RIR concepts, or the repetitions in reserve concepts. And some people have bastardized this and kind of quoted it incorrectly and said, listen, it's the last 5 reps before failure. Those are the only reps that matter. Incorrect. All the reps leading up to that mattered. Those are probably just the ones that send the strongest hypertrophic signal. Well, how do I arrive at those 5 repetitions? Well, I fatigue through my low threshold motor units, and then I start to activate my high threshold motor units. Basic Henneman size principle. Read an exercise physiology textbook. This will be one of the first things that you learn. The last note that we want to make here is that certain things like injury risk and technique degradation do matter. So if I'm pre-exhausting my quadriceps and then going in to do a back squat and my squat technique greatly suffers and all of a sudden I'm doing a good morning squat and I'm feeling it entirely in my back, was that pre-exhausting actually effective? Well, no, it wasn't, because I fatigued my quads to the point where they're no longer active in the movement. So you do want to pay attention to and manipulate the load accordingly with how fatigued you are. So factor that kind of stuff in when you're choosing exercise order. Now, I used to be a big believer, you put your compound movements first because that's where you can do the most weight, and that's how you stimulate the greatest amount of hypertrophy because it's the highest level of tension. But as I've kind of thought deeper into it, I said, hey man, there's kind of multiple ways to skin the cat here. Let's not throw any of these ones out. So again, comes back to maybe personal preference, but injury risk and technique degradation is a big one as well. So in the picture over here for strength, we'll ignore that a little bit. Both of these could be very, very effective in terms of building muscle mass. They're both similar ways to arrive at the same point. The final thing to look at, or the last two things to look at on exercise order, is what kind of split are we using? So is it a full body split? If it's a full body split, should we alternate upper and lower exercises? So allow the upper body to recover while I do a lower body exercise and vice versa. Are these upper and lower days? Because then we can alternate push-pull exercise, allow the pull exercises to recover while I'm doing a push exercise and vice versa. In a push-pull legs, maybe you alternate muscle groups. So on a push day, it's chest, shoulders, and triceps. You do a chest, then a shoulder, then a tricep to allow the muscle to recover. But if we look at something like the effective reps concept, it might make more sense, or it maybe could make more sense, that we don't alternate body parts. We fatigue the muscle, therefore we reach those effective reps faster. So we run bench press, followed by incline dumbbell press, followed by a pec deck fly. We run it in that order, and the fatigue that I incur running those exercises sequentially allows me to get to those effective reps, those high threshold reps, faster than if I were to allow that muscle to fully recover. This is also kind of an argument for shortening your rest periods as well. Now, if we looked at this stuff in the research and we compared two groups that were using this, I suspect that if, again, volume and intensity were equated between the two groups, we would see very similar results. Just a way to arrive at the same point. And then last but not least, application of certain special techniques. So these special techniques like supersets, compound sets, giant sets, myo reps, rest pause, there's a lot of them. You've heard all of these, and maybe you haven't even heard some of them, and they're worth a Google. But how you apply them and where you put them in a training program is going to depend upon what you're trying to get out of them. So what I recommend is when you sit down and you write, okay, I'm going to put some myo reps in this month's program, always go for the why test first. Why am I putting it in there? What am I trying to get out of it? Well, I'm doing some myo reps on leg extensions to fatigue my quadriceps going into squat so I can use a lower absolute load so that my back doesn't hurt and my quads do the majority of the work. All right, that makes sense. But if you're saying I'm throwing in myo reps because myo reps are the shit and jack people do them, let's get a better explanation than that maybe. And that wraps us up on step 3 and step 4 of your program design series. In the last part of the series, part 3, we're going to be talking about assigning load and repetitions and the inverse relationship there. We're going to be talking about volume. Everyone loves to talk about volume, and then what kind of rest periods to use. So we'll tackle 3 steps in our final part. As always, subscribe to our YouTube. Follow us on Instagram. You can find us at Gifted Performance on any of the social media platforms, even Twitter. We don't use Twitter, but go follow us. $30 monthly automated coaching via the website. Get access to our 15 well-designed resistance training programs, as well as macronutrient programming and body weight logging. Through that, you always get your first 2 weeks over here. If you are looking for one-on-one coaching, we've got 9 very qualified coaches to work with. Everything from hypertrophy training, strength training, weightlifting, powerlifting, bodybuilding, off-season, and prep and contest prep. So apply to work with one of our one-on-one coaches. You know the drill. Stay gifted.